Hey there, how there, ho there, it's Jeff Cutter Diamond welcoming you to yet another Cutter Top 10 video, and today we're going to be looking at the top 10 NHL draft steals of all time, of course, rocking the Leafs jersey, so, it's an NHL one. Of course, you see the NHL crest, so you knew it's going to be an NHL list, so we're going to take a look at that. Actually, no, I wrote that down. Sorry, I wrote that down wrong. We're going to be looking at the top 10 NHL controversies of all time. Yeah, there. We've got a lot of things going on here. All right, so here are the most controversial moments of all time in the NHL. Number 10, all the officiating controversies. So, like it or not, officials really make things bad in sports and all that. One brutal mistake is all it takes. There are a few of them that will make the list on their own, but one of them that, well, as biased as I possibly am, in 1993, when the Leafs took on the Kings in the conference finals, the Leafs were one win away from going to the Stanley Cup finals. All they needed to do was win Game 6 in LA. Anyway, Toronto and LA were in overtime. Gretzky and Gilmore went for the puck, but Gretzky clipped Gilmore. Instead of giving Gretzky a 2-minute penalty or a 5, as some people said, Kerry Fraser did nothing. He did claim that it was the follow through of Gretzky's stick that clipped Gilmore. And on a follow through, it was in front. But come on, 2-minute penalty? Come on, blood. Anyway, you got a lot of things going here. But Gretzky scored the overtime goal to force a Game 7 at Maple Leaf Gardens, and the Leafs lost. So that was brutal. Number 9, the Vancouver Canucks riot in 2011. The Canucks were poised to win the Stanley Cup against the Boston Bruins. They needed to start off fast in Vancouver. The first two games were in Vancouver, which they won narrowly 1-0 in game 1 with 15 seconds left. And then a 2-1 win 11 seconds into overtime. Unfortunately, Vancouver blew up in Boston, won Game 5 at home, lost Game 6, and then in Game 7, the Canucks were supposed to win at home, but lost 4-0 to Tim Thomas and the Bruins. What's worse was that Vancouver went up in smoke in a sense. If you watched the special 30 for 30 called I Just Here for the Riot, it details the 2011 Stanley Cup riot. The fans went nuts. Massive property damage, massive injuries, and raising questions about fan conduct. Unfortunately, that wasn't the first time Vancouver kind of went up in smoke. 94, when they lost Game 7 to the Rangers, they went bonkers. But yeah, the riot was huge. And of course, social media played a part in outing people and all that. So that's what happened. Number 8 is the Blackhawks with their sexual abuse scandal. It was massive that a staff member would do sexual abuse on some former Chicago Blackhawks players. Not really the big names, but like the third and fourth liners, if you will. They needed accountability and all that. It forced Joe Quenneville from the league for years. Like Coach Q probably would have done better in the NHL if he wasn't forced out. Nobody would draft him as a coach. Anyway, number 7 is Sean Avery with his sloppy seconds comment, 2008. So what happened was that Sean Avery was making a comment. Like, he signed with Dallas as a free agent from the New York Rangers, and then before a game against Calgary, Sean Avery basically said some stuff about Dion Phaneuf's dating his sloppy seconds, because Sean Avery used to date Alicia Cuthbert. Canadians would know her from Popular Mechanics for Kids and the movie The Girl Next Door, and even from 24. Well, the Americans would too. But Sean and Alicia used to date, and then Dion would date Alicia Cuthbert and eventually marry her. Unfortunately, though, even though Avery was saying he was trying to make the game very interesting and all that and watchable, it backfired. He got a 6-game suspension. Dallas basically cut ties with him, and the Rangers picked him up on waivers. It was just inappropriate comments about players' relationships and all that. Number 6 is the 2005 NHL lockout. This wasn't the first lockout in NHL history. In 1992, which I didn't know till I was, 13 or 14 years old, I learned that there was a 10-day lockout because players wanted better free agent stuff and merchant and money from hockey cards, which was a commodity at the moment. So anyway, yeah, in 0405, um, yeah, the NHL locked out. But yeah, 92, there was a 10-day lockout that almost ruined the playoffs. And then 94, 95, there was a lockout, but that got restored by February, not by January. And then, came the 0405 lockout day, the day after the World Cup of Hockey ended. Unfortunately, both sides of the table were in the wrong about the whole salary cap issues and implementing the shootout and all that stuff. The Players Association, I think, got bit the most, as Bob Goodenow was kind of being a little greedy and all that. So were Batman and the owners. Thankfully, though, the NHL solved that labor dispute. Unfortunately, it caused the cancellation of the 0405 season. Who knows who would have won the Stanley Cup that year? Some say Detroit. Well, it doesn't matter. Number 5 is Todd Bertuzzi's attack on Steve Moore in 2004. So a few months before the NHL lockout started in March 2004, the Canucks were playing the Avalanche in Vancouver. The only problem was that Steve Moore, Colorado Avalanche player, had cheap shot at Marcus Naslund, the Canucks captain, and forced him to get hurt. So the Canucks needed to teach Steve Moore a lesson. They kind of did in the first few periods, needling him, but Bertuzzi took it one step further in the third period of a Colorado rout as he skated to Steve Moore and then punched him and pushed him to the ice. Unfortunately, though, a few other bodies were on top of Bertuzzi and Moore would have a cervical injury. Well, that it was a career-ending injury. There was criminal charges, civil litigation, and widespread discussion about violence in hockey, especially payback and all that. Needling a player, all that, because he hurt your captain is one thing. Unfortunately, though, this wasn't the first time. In 2000, McSorley would try to kneel Donald Brashear to a fight and then accidentally smack his stick on Brashear's head and giving McSorley basically what they call a career-ending suspension. Bertuzzi was given a massive suspension for the rest of the 2004 regular season and playoffs. If Bertuzzi had been smart about it, I think the Canucks would have had a good playoff run, and we wouldn't see Calgary with a playoff run. Unfortunately, though, Bertuzzi made some stupid mistakes. He did own up to it. He came back to the NHL, but he wasn't the same after. Number 4 is the Brett Hull no goal from 1999. So the Stanley Cup final would have Dallas versus Buffalo. The Leafs fumbled in the conference final against the Sabres. Anyway, yeah. Dallas and Buffalo played a good series, and then Game 6 went to triple overtime in Buffalo, in which Brett Hull scored seemingly the cup-winning goal. And it was Dallas Stanley Cup win. However, people were upset because his skate was in the crease, and you were not allowed to have a skate in the crease and score a goal. So practically that meant that the goal would have been waved off and we keep going. However, the officials allowed the goal to stand and Dallas won the Stanley Cup. I think some people said because it was triple overtime, they just wanted to get out of there. But no, that was kind of wrong. But the fact of the matter was the rule was the skate in the crease and all that. They had a case, the Sabre fans. But the NHL sent out a memo to the officials saying that if the player had possession of the puck while his skate was in the crease, then it's okay. But they didn't memo it to everyone else. Thus, everyone got pissed off. The Sabres and their fans are infuriated, and the Sabres have gone downhill ever since. Number 3 is the Spanish flu pandemic ruining the Stanley Cup final in 1919. Of course, we all know 2005, the Stanley Cup final was not held because of the whole lockout. And in 2020, even though that COVID-19 had ruined things, they had to have the Stanley Cup final in August. Nevertheless, the first Stanley Cup final to be destroyed was 1919, but for good reason, too. Montreal was playing Seattle. Now, of course, the rules of the Stanley Cup final were different. Before 1927, well, between 1918 and 1927, the NHL's champion would meet a Western champion from the Western Canadian Hockey League or the Western Hockey League, the Pacific Coast Hockey Association. Anyway, Montreal would take on Seattle in the Stanley Cup final as it was the Pacific Coast champion versus the NHL champion. After 5 games, it was 2 wins apiece with 1 tie. All the games were in Seattle. They had the Stanley Cup Finals in one city at the time, and not just both cities. Unfortunately, though, the world would change that, as in 1919, North America was, well, worldwide, it was hit hard with what they called the Spanish flu pandemic, something that had not been heard of, pandemic, for over 100 years. So in 1919, the Spanish flu ruined the world's population. Of course, it was a lot less people nowadays. And let's not forget that medical advances were not the same in 1919 as they are in 2025. So the fact of the matter is that, the pandemic, it could have been a lot better if medical technology from our time would have been used on their time. Unfortunately, though, Montreal lost some players to the flu. Well, not dead specifically, but like sick. Legendary Montreal owner Georges Kennedy was there, and also Joe Hall, a great defenseman for the Habs, although he would succumb to the pandemic. Montreal asked for players from another team to fill their roster until the final was over. Seattle refused. Seattle actually did. No, Montreal did tell Seattle they could have the championship because too many of the players were sick. But Seattle graciously said, no, we don't want to win that way. And no, there was no winner. Number 2 is Wayne Gretzky being traded in 1988. So Wayne Gretzky was this big wonder kid coming from the World Hockey Association. People forget that he started out life in the World Hockey Association, which was trying to ruin the NHL, and partially did, but more than likely didn't. With their high salaries, but teams folding every year, like umbrellas. Gretzky would be traded from Indianapolis to Edmonton weeks before they had to fold. And, he was there for Edmonton. Edmonton took him in the expansion draft, and then, he was a big boy for Edmonton, winning 4 Stanley Cups. Could have been 5 if it wasn't for Steve Smith, but that's not blame Steve Smith for that. The fact of the matter was that Gretzky was Canada's treasure and all that. Hell, he had a Hollywood-style wedding to Jen Jones, an actress from Hollywood, and basically CBC covered it. Unfortunately, though, behind the scenes, Peter Podgleton was losing money hand over foot, so he had to make money. So he made a massive trade to the LA Kings, trading Gretzky and Marty McSorley. I think he traded someone else, didn't he? I keep thinking he traded a third guy. But nevertheless, Gretzky went to the LA Kings, while Marty McSorley was added to the Gretzky trade at Gretzky's behest. LA sent back Martin Jelena. Oh no, Edmonton traded Krusheletsky to LA. And LA sent back Martin Jelena, a prospect, Jimmy Carson, who was a pretty good player in his own right. $15 million and three first-round picks, which did not work well for the Oilers, as every player they picked with those first-round picks went bust. Shelona would win a Stanley Cup with Edmonton in 1990, but then would be known for his overtime killer goals, especially in 2002 with the Canes taking out the Leafs in the conference final, and in 2004 getting the game-winning goal in every series Calgary went to, even the Stanley Cup final, if it was given. And then you got yourself, Jimmy Carson. He was a malcontent. He didn't want to go to Northern Alberta, so he forced a trade to Detroit, which sent Edmonton Joe Murphy and Peter Klima. But that worked out in Edmonton's favor. Carson. But nevertheless, Wayne Gretzky being traded was huge. Canada was so ticked off, a member of parliament wanted the trade to be vetoed. The trade would be good, Well, Gretzky shed 99 tears, as they called it, in his press conference. But then in LA, he was smiling and put the new silver and black shirt of the Kings on him. Everyone thought he was a national traitor. Paul Clinton was burned in effigy. It was disastrous. That trade inadvertently led to the boom of southern U.S. hockey franchises, especially sending Winnipeg and Quebec out of there and onto Phoenix and Colorado. Well, Quebec to Colorado makes sense because Colorado at least was a decent hockey market, but Phoenix, that state doesn't know hockey except for bringing up Austin Matthews, which is fine. And I think Clayton Keller too. But the fact is that, the southern teams, like Dallas got a team, two Florida's franchises, basically the southern U.S. got to do the NHL because of Gretzky's trade, and fuck you, Gary Bettman. And number one is the Rocket Richard ride of 1955. This was huge because this was not just about a hockey incident. This was provincial, politics, Canadian politics. I know it's biased because of my national pride, but the fact is that Richard's thing was disastrous. 1955, Richard had basically been given a bad boy reputation. He had basically attacked players, attacked linesmen, and wrote a newspaper column criticizing people. So basically, he knew he had to be careful. But in 1955, he actually, in a game against the Boston Bruins, he actually attacked Hal Laycoe with a stick and then assaulted Cliff Thompson, the linesman who was trying to help finish the problem. Unfortunately, though, Clarence Campbell, the NHL president, sought to make an example of Richard and basically suspend him for the regular season and the playoffs. So Montreal was decimated in a sense. However, the worst part is because the NHL headquarters were in Montreal, fans basically pummeled the headquarters with angry phone calls. And, the people in Montreal thought that Clarence Campbell was being elitist and basically punishing Richard because he was French. What if he was English born? So the Habs had a game on St. Patrick's Day, 1955, against the Red Wings, a fight for first place in the NHL, in the 16 NHL. Campbell made a decision to take his secretary with him to the game. He was actually going to sit in the stands, which was like pouring gasoline onto a fire. Fans took notice, would bombard him with objects, and then one fan actually punched him. And then at the end of the first period, a tear gas bomb happened. And the game had to be canceled. Detroit beats Montreal 4-1. And it didn't end there. The fans would riot in Montreal. They would basically destroy storefronts and all that. A lot of French and English places were busted up. There was widespread outrage. But what is the biggest thing? Well, Richard did take to the radio and TV the next day and said that, he accepted the suspension and all that. And it calmed everyone down. But the fact of the matter is, it inadvertently lit the candle for French Canada to finally try to take control of Quebec and all that. The Quiet Revolution, as they call it in Quebec. And English businesses would suffer gratefully. Sun Life, NHL, a few places, Bank of Montreal would move from Montreal to Toronto for their headquarters. And also the fact is that the French government, like the French Canadian government, basically made English a sin in a sense. So you can kind of understand that, they were trying to get their voice back, and the French Canadians got their voice. So that was the biggest thing of all. Say what you want, but I think that this basically led to English Canada deciding to pack up from Quebec and move to Ontario where they belong. Stupid, as stupid does. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond. I do.